Bueno, como os decía, en esta sesión vamos a recuperar un poco el tema del contacto con la familia de origen, que comentábamos también en alguna sesión de ayer y de esta mañana. Tenemos aquí a dos personas que son la doctora Pinto y la doctora Anouk Houdijk también, que vienen del CONTACTO Adoption and Foster Team del Maudsley Hospital de Londres. Es un equipo altamente especializado en el tema de adopción y acogimiento en los temas de salud mental. Ellos van a exponernos cómo funcionan desde cuál es la perspectiva del Reino Unido en este tema, cómo evolucionan, cómo se han planteado el tema del contacto, cuáles pueden ser los beneficios y los retos tanto para el menor como para la familia biológica y la familia adoptiva o la familia de acogida. Bueno, pues durante estos últimos 6 meses del año pasado he tenido la gran oportunidad de estar trabajando con ellos en el equipo. La verdad es que ha sido todo un placer y les agradezco mucho que estén aquí con nosotros hoy para presentarnos su punto de vista, cómo tratan el tema y a ver qué podemos hacer desde España para poder adoptar un modelo en base a países que ya tienen experiencia en esto. Bueno, pues sin más, os doy paso a la doctora Pinto, que va a empezar con la presentación. Muchas gracias.
Vale, muchas gracias, Natalia, y muchas gracias a AFIN por invitarnos a estar hoy aquí. Hemos disfrutado mucho de la conferencia hasta ahora y de Barcelona también, que nos encanta. Voy a hacer la presentación en inglés porque la vamos a hacer entre las dos. O sea, sé que es una sesión un poco difícil. Ya a la última de la mañana todo el mundo está un poco cansado, entonces así vamos a intentar que nos durmáis. Entonces voy a pasar a inglés si no os importa. As Natalia said, we are part of the National Adoption and Fostering Team in the Maudsley Hospital. And well, basically in the presentation today we are going to be telling you a little bit about our team and how we work, but also we are going to give you some history of adoption and fostering in the UK. We'll tell you a little bit of evidence of what is known about contact with the birth families, and we'll continue, towards the end we'll give you some references as well, which we have been reading to prepare this presentation. Has been really interesting. So to start with our team, we are a multidisciplinary team where we have psychologists, psychiatrists, and social workers, and specialized clinicians in parenting. And we see adopted and fostered children from birth to 18 years old. We take referrals from general practitioners, GPs, from pediatricians, from other services on mental health, and basically one of the things I wanted to say is that we are going to offer a mental health perspective, so maybe it's a bit different from what we have seen up till now. And obviously we are a national service, which means that we get second opinions and we see quite a lot of problem cases. So maybe everybody not get very panicky about some of the cases that we will present today. We offer a very thorough assessment, and this lasts for a whole sort of afternoon, in which we interview anybody who is involved with the child. So we invite either foster carers, adoptive parents, birth parents if they are available, and obviously the child. The child is seen separately also, and we do like individual assessment. We also do cognitive assessment. And then after that, we formulate the plan. In some of the cases, we just give recommendations for local services, wherever, in Scotland, Wales, wherever, to apply these strategies. Sometimes we apply. We see the patients for interventions. So one thing that the Maudsley Hospital is known in the world is because of the evidence base. This means that it's a pioneer center in using interventions that have been proved in scientific studies that work. I'm saying this because at least in the UK there is quite a lot of people interested in the adoption field, in mental health of the children that are adopted or fostered, and many of them are not using these these strategies. We use, for example, well-known parenting interventions like parent-child game. Parent-child game has been studied thoroughly, and it's really helpful to, first of all, manage behavioral problems in the children, but also to increase attachment and increase sensitive responding from the carer or parent. We have the family in a room playing, and the carer has an earbag, and the team is behind the screen, and we are coaching them into different strategies to apply with the child. So that's our core intervention, but we also use cognitive behavioral therapy, for example, for the child, if we have found that there is, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder that was not recognized before. We use mindfulness, we use life story work, we also use family therapy, and medication for those children that we have diagnosed with any mental health problem that requires medication, such as attention deficit disorder or severe depression, for example, always following the NICE guidelines, which are the government guidelines in the UK that suggest that children and adolescents should not be only treated with medication, but also a psychological therapy. We use a systemic model, which means that we are always in touch with education, with social services, and attending all these meetings is a big part of our work. I will say something briefly on the historical context of adoption in the UK and fostering, and also linking this with birth families that you were mentioning yesterday, because it's quite interesting, the fascination with orphans in the literature, for example, like, you know, in fairy tales. Many of the fairy tales princesses were orphans. And then in British literature through the centuries, well, we have Jane Eyre was an orphan, Dickens' Great Expectations, Pip was an orphan. But in all these cases, being an orphan means that you completely lose touch with your birth family. So I think the metaphor goes along fighting hardship and fighting difficult situations on your own without your parents. So this links a bit with the history of adoption and fostering in the UK, which was a very secretive issue through history. And when they have tried to establish when it started and what happened, they have had to go to records in local authorities or even the Home Office, because this history was not there in the people, so to speak. In 1720, the Captain Thomas Coram set up a hospital for all the sort of abandoned children in London. So that was a big problem at that stage. And at the moment, Coram is a charity in the UK that deals with adoption, and they do a particular type of adoption called concurrent planning that we can go into that in if we have time. In the 19th century, there is the concept of baby farming, which is like quite a pejorative term in British sort of imaginary, because this encompassed a range of experiences of adoption and fostering, in which some of them were normal fostering, but some of them were quite abusive. So in the Victorian, it's part of the Victorian imagination of child abuse, really. But there was really no legislation. So in the First World War, there were these three organizations that I listed there: the National Child Adoption Association, National Adoption Society, and the National Council for the Unmarried Mothers, that already were pushing for legislation about adoption. The first Adoption Act was passed in 1926, and obviously, after the Second World War, there was another Adoption Act after all the orphans and that were left after the war. Anna Freud set up in Hampstead a nursery for orphans of the war. And particularly interest for me in terms of the relationship between the UK and Spain, where John Langdon Davis, who was a journalist and a writer, and he came to the Spanish Civil War, and then when he saw all the orphans after the Civil War, he set up this organization called PLAN, which is still running. And obviously the Basque children in 1937 that went from Southampton, from Bilbao to Southampton, and they still have an organization there in the UK. Now Anouk is going to tell us a little bit about nowadays legislation.
So just to set adoption in context in the UK, the National Office of Statistics show that between 4,000 and 5,000 children are placed on the adoption register in the UK every year. And on the presentation here, you can see the exact figures for 2010. Now, the vast majority of these children are adopted directly from foster care. And 60% of these children who are in foster care are actually in foster care under a care order, which means that they've been removed from their family of origin because of concerns about the parents' capacity to parent for those children, or because of child protection concerns directly around abuse or neglect. In terms of international adoptions, we have less information on that, but it's believed that about 400, there are about 400 international adoptions per year in the UK. Oh. Is that better? Okay. But contact in the UK is a very important thing, and actually a study in 2002 showed that approximately 89% of children who were due to be adopted, there were also plans for direct contact with their biological families, which were embedded in those agreements. So, and interestingly, the issue of contact is also embedded in the legislation in the UK. And it outlines actually that the court can make decisions about who the child should have contact with. And a number of people can also apply for contact with the child, including the child themselves. So clearly, contact is considered a major issue, and as we've heard from yesterday, it is believed to be very beneficial for the child. But actually what's less clear is exactly in what ways, from a psychological perspective and a developmental perspective, is this of benefit. And indeed, about 50 years ago, adoptions were quite closed. They may not have been revealed to the child at all. And data showing that that adopted children were actually 2 to 5 times more likely to present for psychological therapies, and that differences seem to emerge between adopted children's and non-adopted children's sort of mental health needs in the middle childhood to adolescent years, suggested that there may be some more sort of psychosocial difficulties going on over neurological or biological difficulties. But again, these studies are mainly correlational, and we know that lots of things contribute to a child's development, including neurological factors, biological, psychological, and social. But this was one of the thought processes. We'll skip over this one. So what's the evidence in terms of how does contact benefit children's development and adjustment? And again, the research is quite limited in this area and very inconclusive. There's been some studies done, but because of differences between the way these studies have been conducted, differences between the ages of the children who've been placed, different measures that have been used, etc., there's very little overlap, and so it's very hard to pull these studies together and make sort of significant conclusions. However, the first 3 studies here were actually studies conducted on children in foster care, and it showed that children who were visited by their biological families whilst they were in foster care were much more likely to return home, and they had a much greater sort of improved sense of self-esteem and sense of self than those who weren't visited during foster care.